Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started as the last of you find your seats. My name's Robert Kett. I'm one of the co-instructors for LNS 25 and one of the co-organizers of A&D Thursdays this semester. We're thrilled to have Sara Dean with us today. Before we get started, I want to reiterate an announcement I made on Tuesday to the students in LNS 25. But for those of you who weren't with us, I want to make sure everyone's aware that we have another exciting talk coming up tomorrow at the Jacobs Institute at noon. We had Mimi Zeiger, a design curator, with us last week. Tomorrow we'll be having Mario Ballesteros up from Mexico City. He's a curator based in Mexico City, oversaw the space Archivo for a number of years, and is working on this year's Abierto Fest. So if you want to join us at noon, you can find more information at programs.jacobshall.org. We'd love to see you there. But today, I'm extremely excited and happy to welcome a really wonderful colleague and friend, Sara Dean, to Berkeley today. Sara is an architect and designer based in the Bay Area, and currently she's assistant professor and assistant chair of graduate design at the California College of the Arts. Sara's trained in architecture and communications design, and she leverages spatial interventions and emerging technologies to develop new futures for social and environmental justice. Her projects have offered community-driven tools that respond to challenges from fake news and urban protest to climate change disasters through tactical interventions. How can wayfinding promote awareness of climate change? Can apps and emoji prepare us to respond to environmental disasters? What can augmented reality teach us about the history of urban protest? What tools does the designer require to intervene in the age of the Anthropocene? These are some of the many questions that Sara has posed and answered in dialogue with fellow designers and in partnership with local communities. She's also exhibited her projects globally at places like the Otago Museum, the Exploratorium in San Francisco, and the Venice Biennale, which we heard about last week. She has an upcoming exhibition as well at the Shenzhen Biennale. Closer to home, Dean is a co-founder of the gallery, design studio, and co-working space If Then in North Berkeley, which is a really wonderful hub for community-engaged efforts to think through issues of sustainability, urban development, and emerging technology. Through exhibitions, community walks, and pop-ups, If Then offers a model for design embedded in and responsive to history, locale, and situated needs. As I'm sure Sara will make clear in her talk today, her practice is a really rich one and offers a varied set of tools for designers grappling with urgent questions of collective concern today. Interested not in new utopias or totalizing solutions, but in the everyday work of living, designing, and thriving in place. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Sara.
Thanks, Robert. Robert has participated in some of our If-Then rambles around town, which has been great. Okay, so hello. I'm going to really focus on method and action today. I know you're all students working on these issues, and hopefully this opens up some dialogue about what we can do. All right. Stuart Brand opened his book, Two Cybernetic Frontiers, with this dichotomy: a photo of a galaxy cluster from space and a screen grab from the computer game Space War. Their visual similarity is striking, but it's not the point. The book is dedicated to their difference, and maybe this talk is dedicated to their difference, because their difference focuses on their operation and our agency in these two systems, rather than their appearance. He says, the hackers made Space War, not the planners. When computers become available to everyone, the hackers take over. We are all computer bums, all the more empowered as individuals and as cooperators. And my provocation to you, what are we primed to do, and how are we primed to behave in the world now that we're all computer bums? Empowered as individuals and cooperators. So in this talk, I'm going to walk through 5 stories that explore methods of finding agency and activism in a system. But first, I'm going to set up some ways to think about systems in general and how they reveal themselves to us. So one way to see systems is through their failures. Much like an analog and digital photo appear the same until there's a glitch, the difference is exposed through the failure. When Tesla released their self-driving car software in the height of self-driving optimism, this was the diagram that they released with it. It shows the communication system, the sight of the car, seeing the environment through a cone of visibility, proximity sensing, and satellite communication. The view of the driver is replaced with the sight of the car itself. But the diagram is most spectacular through what information it excludes. It doesn't show the city, pedestrians, bicyclists, animals, buildings, curbs. It shows a complete closed system by removing any element that's not accounted for within that system. The sensor system has no possible failure states in this drawing. It removes the potential for intervention in the system by making it a closed feedback loop. Around the same time, Google patented this sticky hood. Here's one of the failure states of that closed thing-to-thing automated transportation system. According to the patent, Google would solve the problem of difficult-to-detect pedestrians by simply gluing them to the hood of a car to avoid running over them. So we can see the optimism of the self-driving system in Tesla's diagram and the edges of it in this patent drawing. Or this urban failure state, the demolition of an informal settlement in Jakarta, Indonesia, the exploitation of labor and the insecurity of laborers in our cities today, compounded by the deforestation of Indonesia's rainforests for palm oil plantations, forcing people to flee the countryside into informal settlements in the city. Or this failure state, where a national capital is moving because of its vulnerability faced due to climate change, including ongoing and increased flooding in this delta region, and ground subsidence because of development pressures, and the channeling and walling of its rivers. So failures allow us to see the edges of a given system, and likewise, accounting for externalities in a system is a necessity of understanding its reaches or its larger extents. So this is George Koopman. He founded the American Rocket Company in California, trying to make a privatized rocket industry. In the 1980s, they went to speak to Congress to argue for more expensive rockets, which might seem counterintuitive. But his argument was that the unaccounted costs in NASA, the subsidizing of the rocket industry, was allowing NASA to operate, but disallowing private development of technology. So these externalities in labor and materials and technology development would make it impossible for him to compete or even to describe the costs and complexities of rocket making as a business. Or in the present day, we can look to the external costs of gig economy companies who subsidize the actual cost of goods and appear both affordable and solvent. So our consumer costs of these services seem affordable, but that's because we're not accounting for intentional business losses or a lack of taxation because of classification loopholes, or healthcare or maintenance costs picked up by independent contractors. So gig economies feel equitable and financially solvent on the consumer side because they add costs and inequities outside of the business model. So this is to say, to intervene in a system, we have to first understand the extent of the system. Externalities are a way to often exploit, burden, or brutalize people and environments. And so as we learned in The Good Place, the act of buying flowers has unintended consequences. Their massive carbon footprint, environmental impacts of pesticides, exploitive labor practices, and the company's ethics are all bought along with the flowers. And if externalities are left unaccounted for, what we're doing is simply recreating the values and blind spots in the system to begin with. So, what do we do? When we think of designing technology or engaging points in a city, we often think of it this way, as a digital overlay. This is the digital overlay of the fast track infrastructure on the Bay Bridge. This is an overlay of feedback loops, inputs, outputs, and spatial data. And this type of intervention is low on Donella Meadows' list of leverage points on the system. When we talk about designing, we're often talking about these low-level interventions, changes in quantities, efficiencies, and features. The 4 top items here, changing the rules, self-organizing, changing the system goals, or the paradigm of the system, are where we're going to focus today. And this was a story recently in the news that unintentionally exposed a system. A California man got a custom license plate reading null, hoping not to be able to get a ticket. The plate would appear as a null value in the plate recognition data. Instead, as soon as he got a ticket, his plate was associated with all of the null values in the system. And he was attached to thousands of tickets, and he received a bill for $12,000 in the mail. So this unintentional interaction with a system exposed the system in an unpredicted way. Or this license plate hack from Poland, the hackers created a simple SQL statement that intends to erase the whole database when the plate is added to it. Whether it's functional or not, the plate is suggestive of the potential of design to interact across media, physical and digital, material and virtual, by acknowledging the field of play between things and people of the smart city. So with these 2 license plate examples, the question is, how can we engage systems intelligently with an eye to other ends, functional possibilities lying within the system, and allowable results within the system at play in our cities? How can we see systems as a field of play rather than a predetermined set of inputs and outputs? And this is one of my favorite examples of that. In November 2015, there was a terrorist threat in Brussels, and the police asked all the residents to go home. And they put a lockdown on the city. And because everyone was stuck at home, what did they do? Well, they started using social media to try to figure out what was going on. So the police, also on Twitter, responded by asking people to stop doing that because they were worried that the terrorists would use these hashtags to figure out what the police were doing. But Twitter isn't good at radio silence. It's better at noise. And so the Brussels community responded to the police by tweeting cat pics and other digital noise on the hashtag to hide any actual information being shared. They obfuscated any real information about the police operation through an overload of intentional nonsense. In other words, they used the internet and the Twitter to do what they do best, bombarding you with information. They changed the purpose of the tool through finding opportunities intrinsic to the system and technology. So today we're going to walk through a few stories of, in terms of locating ways of intervening, locating scales, formats, and methods of exploitation, now in a positive sense, in a system. The question I want to pose as architects and designers and engineers and whatever discipline you're coming from is, how do we work farther up the Meadows interventions in a system? Not just adjusting the quantities or effects, but allowing greater play in the structure of itself, allowing for self-organization or even a new value system, ways of designing exploits. So the first story I want to tell is about creating commons. So as Robert said, I've been working for the last 2 years on a project with the Riser Science Group, including Mark Stacy at Berkeley, and the Exploratorium, on ways of engaging the city around climate data. One of the challenges that Riser identified before the project even began was that when someone saw a flood map of where climate change would impact the city, and they saw that their house would be dry, they worried less about climate change impacting them. So this "my stoop is not wet" problem, to me, was a question of redefining what we think of as home. So the externalities of our family health and safety, or even our property value. So our home is more than our house. So how can we connect our house with what we actually sense as our home? So the commons of the city include lots of different infrastructures, hard and soft, our drainage system, our transportation networks, parks, open spaces, our shoreline, views, even our air. And so the question to me was not how to connect climate impacts to our houses, but how to have a sense of home in the spaces and networks we use day to day. So through this project, I developed a series of compass roses that combine point data of climate change with environmental orientation. So the form of the compass rose is a known form, and I use a lot of kind of known forms in my work. It's a historic form of wayfinding in, say, a plaza or a hall. So these climate compasses shift from empirical data to environmental orientation, and they locate you in time and in space. So the data the compasses include, oh, wait a minute, I didn't do anything. There we go. The data the compasses include are directions from this point to shore or higher ground and north, a timeline radiating out from the center, which shows the projection of sea level on the location over the next 100 years, and at what point in that timeline 20-year storm surges will occur, and when annual flooding is likely to occur in the area. So thinking of our environment as changing rather than static, and understanding when and where you are in relation to the environment. The first of these is at the Exploratorium now. It's a 10-foot across pad. And it's been interesting to see how it's become a gathering point for social groups. As you can see here, a lot of school lunches and families and kids running around on it, which has been great. One of the things that I think is important as we engage a changing and chaotic environment is that this is a daily experience, not just an emergency. And so how do we engage people without fear and give them a platform to discover the information? So each climate compass is unique to its location, and as a network around the city, they connect public daily spaces to this large abstract story of climate change. In the next month, 4 BART stations are installing climate compasses in their plazas, and we're hoping with the Exploratorium to spread to other public areas around the city, both as a transparent information source about upcoming changes, and a way of literally reading the environment around you. It's often said that climate change is not about who will be affected, but when we will be affected. And so this all in it together kind of attitude is really at the core of this project. And that as we're moving through the city, coming out of a BART plaza, getting groceries, going to a park, we can kind of see this network of both secure and vulnerable areas that we live in. My second story is about hiding in plain sight. So this story takes place in Detroit. Detroit is a city that symbolizes modernity, really. These are photos from the 30s. It has big, large, adorned architecture and wide boulevards, and was a technology industry capital. And it's also a city struggling with scale and emptiness and infrastructure, as we know. So the present-day crisis of Detroit is a very complex one, and I'm not going to try to sum it all up in 4 slides, but I'm going to tell one story about it, which is one of policy and governance. So like many cities in Michigan, the city was turned over to a financial manager in 2013, and by comparison, this happened in Flint, Michigan in 2010. So leading up to this and during this time, the policy for water shutoffs in the city changed. Water bills were doubling or tripling, and the time for shutoff of service due to non-payment was cut to 3 months. So that means if you're a family that's working paycheck to paycheck, and all of a sudden you have a water bill that's 3 times as high and you can't pay it, and then you do pay it, but then you can't pay the next month. After 3 months of having a debt to the water company, your water would be shut off. And then water bill non-payment was started being a classification for blight because it got connected to tax non-payment. And so occupied homes were being added to blight lists and demolition lists, and there was a whole process of bundling single homes into large groups for public auction. So this very quickly and drastically changed the rights of homeowners and the number of homes being taken over by the city. And this is work by We the People of Detroit Community Research Collective. They did an incredible job mapping the impacts of these policy changes. So as you can see here, water shutoffs disproportionately affected minority communities. And water bills contributed in some areas to up to 1/4 of tax foreclosures. So there was a lot of activist response in the city. Here are 3 responses that I want to just mention briefly. The Detroit Light Brigade did a series of demonstrations and performances. The water tower you see here was a message by the Rise Up, a local activist. And at the bottom of this slide is a piece of a fence built by Layla Whitfield and the Freedom and the Detroit Eviction Defense, trying to highlight the eviction that the city was attempting on Whitfield's home. So at the same time, or during this time, a call was put out for a Detroit-oriented U.S. pavilion at the Venice Biennale called the Architectural Imagination, and they were asking for proposals for large-scale interventions in the city. So whether intentionally or not, to Detroiters that spoke of blight and eviction policies and the process underway of bundling lots into 50-lot sales to large developers. So to them, it was treating the city like a tabula rasa. So a group called Detroit Resists wanted to have a community perspective in the Biennale of this activist local work happening around this, and to be present as an uninvited guest in the Biennale. So this is where I got involved in the project and developed with Detroit Resists the idea of an augmented reality installation. So from the language of community organizing, we called it a digital occupation of the U.S. Pavilion. So it was an augmented reality show geolocated at the pavilion, acting to fill a digital void in the city. We digitally installed 3 full-scale models of activist projects, the 3 that I just showed you in the show, the water tower, the eviction fence mural, and 2 of the statements from the Light Brigade. So we flyered the Biennale with instructions of how to see this exhibit, and at the pavilion it could be seen through Layer for free on any smartphone. As you moved around the pavilion, you could see different objects, and where occupying the physical city with an installation required permits, budgets, and invitation, none of which we had, augmented reality existed in the same place without materiality. And the project got a huge amount of press, and if you search for it, you'll find a lot still, which in a way was our audience, was to bring awareness around the activism work around water shutoffs and blight in Detroit. So I just want to point out a couple other examples of this, of hiding in plain sight. Ricardo Dominguez's Transborder Immigration Tool is a series of poems that can be loaded onto a cell phone, leading immigrants through the border crossing without detection and through the desert to water sites. And it's also doesn't have evidence if they're arrested. So the cell phone nobody's looking for what songs are on your phone when you're arrested, and so these maps could hide as poems and songs on the phone. Or hobo symbols, which was a precedent I used in the climate compasses, giving information about safety and amenities and wayfinding for people traveling around the country through the Great Depression. So these would be carved or chalked onto the city to help navigation through time. So you don't have to see anybody using them. You can know that there's food or shelter available in a place, and somebody can come along later and get that information. So the third story I want to tell is about self-organization. So we're going to go back to Jakarta. So Jakarta has one of the largest urbanization rates in the world, and the city's growing at a tremendous speed. It's over doubled in the last 10 years, and you can see going from 6 million to now over 30 million people in the city. So it's caused a lot of issues, and just in terms of the rates of urbanization, and there's been a lot of subsidence. It's a delta region, so it's a subsiding region to begin with. And in this image, green is impervious surface. So you can see that not only is the population exploding, but also the area that the city's taking up is getting larger and larger. So this is what this looks like day to day. So on the left, you can see a man mucking out the street after a flood, and the high water marks over the head of the man on the right eating lunch. These types of floods happen continuously through the monsoon season. And so one of the main challenges that I came into this large multidisciplinary project asking is, what kind of technology or intervention do you use in a periodic emergency? So what kind of intervention do people know to look for when there's an emergency, but they can ignore or not even know about when there's not an emergency? So there have been lots of hard infrastructure projects trying to solve this problem. There's been very in-depth 3D modeling of the city, but the city's changing really fast. There have been seawalls and channeling of canals. There's 13 rivers that run through the city. And so instead, we asked the question of what soft infrastructure or social community infrastructure could help address the flooding. So one of the ways of understanding how to intervene in a complex system or a complex megacity is to ask, where are people already and what are they already doing? So Jakarta, as it turns out, has the largest population of Twitter users of any city in the world. So this project did not start out trying to be a Twitter project. We used Twitter because that's what people were already using. So Twitter was already being used to talk about flooding also. This is a map showing all the times that flood or banjir in Indonesian were tweeted during the 2014 monsoon season. So this is a really noisy, scattered data set, right? And it shows information that is indiscernible in this format. But it also shows a lot of information about sharing routines. So the question is, how do we listen and gather this information? And if we look at that same data through time, we can see that it corresponds really closely to flood events, as you would imagine. So we created a flowchart using Twitter to look for people within Jakarta talking about flooding and talking to us about flooding. And we used this to basically ask and clean data, find and clean data over the course of the monsoon in real time. And similar to what I said about the climate compass, this is a daily part of the urban environment in Jakarta. It's not an emergency, and so, it is also an emergency. So we wanted to echo the casual urban character of tweeters in Jakarta, so that this felt like a community-led project and not either an emergency response research project or an academic project. And the project was entirely open source and really wanted to be community-run and community-owned. So this is what this looks like in practice. It's a real-time map accumulating Twitter data to help people navigate. If you're walking around Jakarta with a phone, you see a map with the area around you, and if you zoom out, the data is a real-time heat map. And one of the things that was really important, and again, using systems as they're already being used, is that the Jakarta Emergency Management agency was trying to get this data as well, and they had a certain scale that they wanted the data and a certain time span that they wanted the data. They would have a district, every district, report to them every 6 hours through the entire monsoon season. So it's like a really heavy top-down system. So we also gave them this bottom-up system at the district level and at the 6-hour interval that allowed them to compare apples to apples and integrate it with their systems. So this is what this looks like on Twitter during our pilot. Since then, it's been adopted by the Jakarta government as a valid source of data, and they can now proactively reach out to districts that might be flooded or that they can see photos of it flooded at any point to see if they need help. And so it's really streamlined the process of getting help to districts that are flooded at any point. And I just wanted to add context to this project from another recent news story. Because there's a lot of news stories like this about startups, and we're in an area that has a lot of fast developing technology. So one concern is a startup that was promising or is promising city tools for emergency management and prevention. And so they have what I'll call a digital overlay on the city to show buildings vulnerable to earthquakes in areas of concern. And San Francisco, until recently, was a subscriber to this service. So in appearance, this is a very similar project. It's an overlay of vulnerability. It's a data-enabled map, right? Very similar. But now what's come out recently about one concern is that they were using mostly residential data to populate their maps, which created a closed system that wasn't able to recognize fail states. And so I would compare this to the Tesla diagram, where it's not adding complexity, it's removing it, and that makes it very hard to intervene in this type of system. So the data can't get better, and it can't even recognize its gaps because it feels like a complete system. The acknowledging the complexities of the environment requires us to build systems that are, that can also adapt to those complexities. So the fourth story I want to tell, I know I'm like zipping through these, but the fourth story I want to tell is about languages. So one of my big takeaways from PETA Jakarta and working with emergency management was that social media was both a very powerful tool in a crisis, but also it was very limited, especially because of language. So emergency response organizations globally work in English. Community communication was happening obviously in local languages and also with local slang. And so it took days and often longer, depending on how localized the language is, for these two groups to be able to talk to each other after an emergency and to be able to communicate through social media for resources and ground information to come together. So as an example, these are 3 of many hashtags for earthquake. And so if you're trying to figure out where earthquakes are happening around the world or who's working on preparedness for earthquakes, you're searching in local languages. So these earthquake is an incredibly popular hashtag. Very much of the populated world have earthquakes. So this is from the Japanese Meteorological Society. This is information about a preparedness workshop. Here's a lifestyle blog talking about emergency food. Here's an Italian earthquake news story. So these are localized events, but really aren't able to collect as a global story. So do you guys know the extinction symbol? Hands? Anybody? No? Okay. Look it up. So the extinction symbol Twitter feed, I think, is a really great example of the use of symbology for a global conversation. So it started, I think, around 5 years ago at this point. And so current events could connect to the idea of the 6th mass extinction, or extinction externalities, as we might call them, could contextualize the conditions creating this extinction. Or historical events could be brought into a current conversation about extinction. And then these symbols started to appear in the physical world and even on bodies. And so now, 5 years later, this has grown from a digital touch point to an analog protest symbol around lots of issues, more general than, or broader than extinction. So climate change and global warming and other environmental issues. So the extinction symbol is now used as a call to action, and if you watch footage or look at photos of recent climate protests around the world, you'll see this symbol pop up all over the place. So I think this is a really interesting example of an icon or a symbol that's able to push past localized conversations and languages and really gather a global story through the tools that we use to gather global stories, which are social media. So one of the projects I've been working on since the work in Jakarta is a set of emoji for climate disaster. So these missing icons would help conversations around emergency and climate change, and they would allow them to gather across languages and platforms. And one of the questions I get asked the most about this project is like, aren't you worried that emoji are really frivolous and like people use them for nonsense? And to me, that's the really powerful thing about emoji is when we have an emergency, we don't switch and start using different tools. We use the same tools we were using the day before, right? And so bringing climate change into an emoji context both allows it to be searchable across all languages. Emoji are the closest thing we have to a global language, like it or not, but also they allow this like individual events and global events to really exist as an ongoing story. So right now these are available on the App Store as stickers, and you can download them for free. And we're also working to get them approved through Unicode as part of the default emoji set, and that's been an ongoing process. So you can search for emoji on the App Store and find them. And then also, meanwhile, while we try to get them adopted by Unicode, we're exhibiting them with documentation about our reasons for creating them and producing physical stickers for the emoji that can be put into the physical environment. So the last story I want to tell is one about Virtuous Cycles. Does anyone know this project? It's still online. Google Will Eat Itself is a project from a while back, and it proposes a system that uses Google ad money to buy Google stock. So over time, the idea is that it can buy Google with Google's own money, that Google pays it to host ads, it uses that money to buy stock, and it creates this loop where it eventually buys Google. So this virtuous cycle is possible through changing the assumptions of a Google ad host. So instead of profiting off of their ad space, the project wants to upend the system from the inside, using Google to upend Google. The ad hosting fees are used in this mode to create a collective ownership model for Google. So you could be part of their collective that starts to expand. So the group of owners is expanding while their stock in Google is expanding. So over the last few years, my studio has been taking on a similar question in terms of housing. Seeing the impacts of Airbnb and other tourist share housing in neighborhoods, taking long-term housing off the market to be turned into short-term housing and tourist housing, as well as in the Bay Area, the minimal housing options being posited to houseless populations. So we see that this was kind of a weird thing, right, where we're extracting resources both in terms of money and in terms of housing stock from neighborhoods to be used for tourist housing, and then people who are long-term residents are being put in sheds, basically, right, or tents. And so we asked, in what way could we flip this script and instead use tourist housing to build equity in neighborhoods and build long-term community and make that more stable? So right now, there's a lot of extracting money that's happening into the tourist industry instead of adding resources through this money for communities. So we've been proposing a pop-up cabin as a minimalist tourist retreat in a neighborhood, And the funds made off of the cabin feed into a community investment fund to support vulnerable populations. And then the community fund can also be built through existing Airbnb rooms that can have a percentage of the cost added to the rental to go to a community fund. And this is a system already built into Airbnb. It just doesn't know it can be used this way, right? So you can have a percentage or a dollar amount automatically go to a house cleaner, or you can split your profits between two owners of a rental. So this is not changing Airbnb. This is changing the outcomes of using the Airbnb service. So this winter, this project is part of the Shenzhen Biennale. In the context of the Biennale, the community is a weird one, right? Because it's an exhibit. So we've moved this for the Biennale from a community project into a closed loop system. So it's a rentable cabin that's literally inside the Shenzhen train station. So if you want to go stay in the Shenzhen train station, you can do that this winter. And so in this case, the cabin rental costs, which are up to the renter, you could rent it for $0 or you could rent it for as much as you'd like, feed a fund that builds more cabins. So it's a house that makes houses. And we're hoping in the Biennale, the cabins seed this system. It's a real-time test of the system. The Biennale goes on for 3 months, so we can see how people use it and what we're able to build. And we're also hoping in the Bay Area to start this as a community pilot project in early 2020. So what I want to advocate for you, designers and architects and engineers, is to act in the world with an eye to the world you want to live in, and not simply recreate the power structures that you see. Be a computer bum in real life, empowered as individuals and cooperators. Make systems that add complexity, not ignore it, and account for externalities to the system. Thanks.
So for the Virtuous Cycle, you know how you showed up the image where it was one housing would, I guess, use the money to get more housing? Would that be considered a positive feedback loop?
Yeah, it would. I think that taking a community-oriented project and making an experiment of it kind of in a bubble, which is what a Biennale kind of is, right, or an exhibition of it, does kind of put it in a loop. I mean, ideally, in a community, what this would do is half the money in our expectation of our test pilot that we're getting ready for this winter or next spring, half the money raised from the cabins would go to more cabins, and half the money would go into a pot for the community. And then ideally, the pot can exponentially grow as the number of cabins grows. So in the Biennale sense, I think absolutely it's a positive feedback loop. And we're part of the Biennale in the research. There's like 2 groups in the Biennale this year, and one is design projects and one is research projects. And so we propose this as a research project to kind of do a lab test in a way of how people engage a space like this as a short-term visitor.
Thank you.
Thanks for the great talk, Sarah. Across those 5 themes that you presented, the projects go from Detroit to Jakarta to the Bay Area. Can you talk a little bit about how that ends up happening, that your projects
Yeah.
take you around the globe and back? And is
Yeah.
that a conscious choice, or is that just the outcome of another process, other priorities?
It's a good question. They give everybody a bit of whiplash of like, now here we are. Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing, well, I'm very driven by engaging cities and that scale of work. And so when and it's hard to engage a city. It's a very complex system. It's multifaceted. The work in Jakarta came out of conversations and, kind of consulting in a team that was based in Michigan and then Australia, and very global kind of team. The project in Detroit came out of work I had already been doing with that group previously on another topic. There's a lot of, building global relationships and collaborations that results in interesting opportunities that I then get hooked into and do. I mean, I think for me, collaboration is probably the key there, where if I was working in isolation, I'd probably just like work on what's in front of me. But I really enjoy being in projects that are very multidisciplinary, and I enjoy being in projects that that are engaging an interesting topic. And those end up being very locally specific to different cities. And the teams often are multi-city or multi-country teams, because that's now so often how we work. So yeah, the opportunities of working across disciplines, I guess, and having people that continue to move around the world and be working in different locations. Does that answer the question? Yeah, so opportunity. Also, when I get excited about a project, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do that. Like, this is what you should do, and let's do it. And then I can sit in my room here and do it, and people are wandering all over the place doing their thing.
You mentioned a lot about accounting for the complexities that are ignored and the different systems that's already in place. Do you think that we could ever reach a stage with any kind of system where you have completely accounted for all the complexities? Like, can you ever have a perfect, complete system?
Well, I mean, I guess the planet is a perfect, complete system, and that, although maybe now we've got externalities to that, I guess I'm not. I'm less interested in making completed systems that like really account for everything than finding opportunities in systems that allow for greater complexity, greater integration between people, greater equity within the system. I think there's a real push right now as we're moving towards more artificial intelligence, more machine learning, more smart systems and infrastructure in cities, to believe that there's a point at which this all just runs itself. And I think that often doesn't then account for things which are not quantifiable, right? Like, we become really good at the things that we can measure. And that's always the case in technology. And so the things that are qualitative, the things that are hard to capture or hard to see through, through a machine, become less and less accounted for. So I think I'm just more interested in locating those and locating agency to kind of do better and move in good directions than I am about like actually finding full edges and being like, okay, this is like a clock, right? Like, this is working like a watch, but in a city,
Building off of the last thing that you had said, how in a project are you factoring in those things that are more difficult or kind of squishy to measure, things that are more qualitative versus quantitative?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's about talking to people. It's about trusting people and community knowledge, ways that people live in a city, and not trying to solve those things, but instead kind of question the solutions that have already been given to them.
Hi, thank you for the talk, by the way. It was wonderful. My question was, you mentioned how with your climate compasses, like a bunch of people started eating lunch on them, and I thought that was very funny. And I was just wondering, like after you kind of like put your project out into the public, there's usually probably that period where people start interacting with it. And I was just wondering, like, are you more excited to see what happens, or are you kind of like, ooh, don't touch that? You know?
I'm definitely more excited to see what happens. I was at a computer conference recently where it was this very interesting series of conversations where everyone was trying to build more equity. It was a whole conference around how do we make more distributed systems, computer systems. Anyway, so everyone kept talking about, like, we give it to the community, we give it to the public. And I was like, but what's it and what's the community? Like this, what does that mean? And they said, well, what does it mean to you? And one thing that I realized was what it means to me is when things start being used in ways I couldn't have anticipated or that I wouldn't have done, then it's not mine anymore, right? And that's a good thing. Like, it shouldn't be mine, because I could just show you and be like, look at this thing I made. But that's about me, When a community starts to engage something and take it on, like Peta Jakarta, we never anticipated, for some reason, how many of the tweets would have photos. Like, of course they would, but like it just wasn't. To us, our metric was words. We were looking for words. We were sending people words. As soon as it started to be a community thing, they were communicating with each other and sharing photos and making decisions, and we had just made a system that they could do that. So really, when things start to be taken over, if I started to see elements of Climate Compass that were like chalked on the ground somewhere else in the city, I'd be like, success, great. Go forth and make data,
Hello, thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I know one of the biggest things in both design and engineering and all sorts of that kind of discipline is that simplicity is key. So with things like the startup that you mentioned, when we oversimplify things, we let complexities go unnoticed. So how do we manage complexity with simplicity?
Yeah, great question. I think you could work on that question for like the rest of your career. So I'll try to sum it up in 2 sentences. Let's see. So to me, the simplicity maybe is in the location, like finding an intersection, telling a story that people can really hook into, locating a scale that really has some agency. Like those things can be described simply. Finding a format, like finding Twitter or public ground installation or whatever it is, those things you can research them and you can test them and they can be simple. The results are probably not simple, and they're probably not, you probably can't even understand what they all are. I can't be at all of those compasses and be like, what did you get out of this? Like, what are you going to do now? Like, that it's, that's less quantifiable. So I think I think locations, and for me, it's always an intersection. Like if there's no friction, I think here's another way to answer this. In a lot of startup pitches and a lot of design end of year reviews and a lot of the ways that we kind of see design, all of the alternatives that weren't tried or that they don't want to do don't exist, right? Like it all goes like this, right? To me, like starting at a nexus means that then there's like a lot of different things you can do. There's a lot of scales you can try. There's a lot of stories. It's a lot of different inputs or different experiences that different communities are going to have. So anyway, this is probably not a helpful answer. But anyway, I would say like the simplicity, you can find simplicity in some points and then just like allow the messiness in other points.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. My question is related to your project at the Venice Biennale with the AR structure. And I was really curious to hear when you said it got a lot of publicity, as opposed to your the Compass project or the tourist rooms project, which have really specific physical components to it. This
Right.
project, without any physicality of it, did you notice that the sort of attention and publicity that it was getting was different in nature? And did people struggle with sharing their experiences organically about it?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the reason, so biennales are weird, like as a community, right? So when we were doing actions and when Detroit Resist was doing actions in Detroit, the impacts were very present. Like they were taking place in the impacted communities, trying to further impact the communities. There were a lot of reasons we picked AR. One, because we could actually be in the Biennale and not down the street. And also because we knew that the kind of community that was coming to the Biennale did have smartphones. They were already paying, they were buying tickets to get into this exclusive space. And so the question really came to be about how to engage this exclusive space, about its exclusivity. So press is a big part of that exclusivity, right? And so that became, really, it's not like we did a huge amount to get press. The Biennale gets press. And being a weird guerrilla project in the Biennale is going to get press. So, for context, what the Detroit Resist was going to do before we started talking was rent a gallery down the street and be, just like take up space nearby. And so that's, the question about technology in that case. In other cases, I would never use AR because it's like a threshold barrier for participation for a lot of communities. But in this case, we felt like it wasn't.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you could speak to the connection between users or people and data, specifically with the Jakarta project. Did you find that it was easy or that you had to prevent yourself from letting the users become numbers as opposed to treating them as human beings? And to what extent does that influence your thinking when it comes to using technology for these big design problems?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's hard to, or there's a lot of pitfalls, of being an outsider in a space. And there's also a lot of advantages to being an outsider in a space. And one of the things that I did a lot of work on was for emergency response. What are the roles and the opportunities of being present in a city? And what are the roles and opportunities of being outside of the emergency? And if you look, for example, at the Haiti earthquake in 2010, which kicked off a lot of this work around emergency response and digital tools, there were two very distinct roles that the ground responders and the expat Haitians that were doing translation work for SMS texts and things like that, they were taking very different roles, right? And so for us, how do we empower this ground truth was the question. And so in the communities, people were able, it was all open source, it still is, so people can look up these tweets. If they were tweeting about Banjir, we added a Twitter card to their tweet saying, hey, here's a resource for you. And so they could use this and to each other, and it was all anonymized because we wanted to, you could still look people up on Twitter, but we weren't attaching personalities or, people to the tweets. They were reports. And then from far away, you could really look at patterns of flooding, which are super hard to predict in Jakarta. It's nearly impossible. And start to understand vulnerabilities and things like that. So it was data when it went into the government kind of war room for emergency response, and it was really community conversation in terms of trying to get around the city.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for doing really inspiring work using design as an agent of change. And kind of related to that, my question is, I've noticed that a lot of your projects are community-based, right? And I just wonder, how do you start to figure out, what the community is and what's the intention behind that? A concrete example that I was thinking of was for the San Francisco campus example. I just wonder, what was the intention of engagement right there, because a lot of times, those who are the most vulnerable are not going to have the privilege to have lunches on those campuses and have the leisure to learn. I just wonder, how do you, it's nice to start the process and change the culture and conversation, but does it sometimes feel like you're scratching the surface? And what's your thought process behind that?
So there's I don't think, the notion that one thing is going to solve everything is, we're beyond that, right? Like, everybody's needed to even get to a point where we can understand what to do. And so really, in terms of technology and locating projects, I do really think a lot about how is a technology adding access or removing access of different populations to a project. With the Compass project in particular, that was a real reason that I wanted this to be analog. And I wanted it to be something that you could pass over every day and kind of be like, well, that's a bright, poppy thing that appeared in public. But then at some point, stop and try to figure it out. And I've been told by people that the project never really made sense to them until they went on a compass and they were able to be like, oh, right, oh, that is where the shore is, and that is, and like try to locate themselves in it. And that's why they're located in public spaces. So we're also looking for space on the Embarcadero. We're talking to parks in different areas. We're talking to Bay Trail. So trying to access people using public space, which is a very broad kind of public, and I would assume, unless someone was really working at it, they might not see all of them, but hopefully we're hitting a lot of people seeing some of them.
Thank you for the great talk. Speaking of the climate change compass, I was wondering how the concept of creating commons, like I remember you mentioning about like the concept of like having a home and house, how it's different, how that is connected to the climate change compass again?
Yeah, great question. So, in this case, the part that was missing, after working with Riser and the climate data and the surveys they had done, was how can people connect to this abstract data that sometimes, 80 years from now, and so transparency of information was one of the things we were trying to do. And in terms of scale and format, how do we connect this into somebody's life, which is day to day? And so the reason that we have been working with BART is because that's such a day-to-day infrastructure that a lot of people rely on, and it's in a lot of the Bay, right, and Bay Area. So there are more vulnerable areas and less vulnerable areas, and it was really interesting, the conversations we've had with BART, where they've been incredibly proactive in terms of adaptation of their own system and future planning for climate change. And they said, well, if we put these in, are people going to want us to have an answer? And I was like, oh my God, can we hold any of us to that standard of like, we know how to fix this? Transparent information like is a radical thing, I think, right now, because it feels so opaque and outside of a scale that we have any agency in. And so, you know, the climate compasses are not a solution, but they are a platform, hopefully, for more conversation and more transparency around changing bay climates.
I have another question for you, which is a repeat question from last week. So last week, Mimi Zeiger was here and talked about the working on the Biennale in Venice. And one of the questions from the audience was, what's the economic model behind that installation? How does it come to be? Where do the funds come from to commission work from these artists? I'm going to repeat the same question to you. For the projects you shared today, what were the economic models behind making that work possible?
Yeah, no, one of the ways that works get into the world and privilege is shown in terms of like the design community is who gets to make these things and who gets access to having work in public. So it's a great question. So let's see if I can kind of run down the Climate Compass work came out of an NEA grant that was in general about connecting science to the arts. So that's been kind of this ongoing conversation, and the Exploratorium really was the house of this work, right? And they are a really interesting institution doing a lot of public installation and having a great connection to the community. The Jakarta work was so multidisciplinary that it came out of multiple grants through institutions and different universities that the various participants were in. What else did I show? Detroit Resist had zero money, and that's why it is a virtual project. So that was a project of passion and energy. And we had architecture students at the University of Michigan and alumni from that program went and photographed these installations to make them skins for 3D models, and it exists virtually. What else did I show? The Shenzhen Biennale, we have a budget from Shenzhen, but the reason I'll say, the Emergy and the Share House, I have tried in many ways to get funding for those projects, and it is hard to get funding for projects you're giving away. Like projects that are community owned, emoji are a public domain. They exist as part of our language on the internet. The same way that you move a character, a language character across the internet and have it received on the other side. That's the same system, Unicode, that is used for emoji. So because there isn't a business model there, we're literally giving these to a free resource for the world. It's proven to be an incredibly unfundable project. So I think that there's something interesting in that, like things that have market, not have impact, because emoji have a huge impact, but it is not. But it also doesn't have a market. So there is a lot that also like trying in off hours to work up to a point that there's actually a thing there is a lot of time, and then we can move into other collaborations that are part of larger projects. So yeah, it's a good question. It's an ongoing process. Oh, there's one.
Hello, thank you for your talk. One of the reasons why the projects that you talked about were so great were because they leveraged technology to create change. Given like new technologies like AI, some of the stuff that you were talking about at the beginning of the talk, are you optimistic? Like, are you saying these are things that I can now hack and use to create change? Or do you believe that the potential negatives are too great to even try?
It's a great question. Again, one you could work on for the rest of your career. So I think in general, I am an optimist in that I'm always looking for potential to use the new tools we have. It's a really challenging moment in that there's been a real consolidation of power, and that power has a lot of access, right? Because of how fluid these new technologies are becoming and increasingly becoming. So the challenges are changing, I'll say that, and I think I worry about in response to technologies rather than systems. So to understand, and the reason that I focus on what are the systems, what are our ways we can intervene in them, what are we gaining by this intervention? Is it, so a new Instagram filter might be changing inputs and outputs, it might be changing quantities of use. How can we move up the ladder in terms of leverage points to create new opportunities within a platform, to create more self-organization and less consolidation within a technology? And there's a lot of opportunities for that. But I don't see those things being challenged very much by the entities that are holding a lot of the control right now. And so I think that's an ongoing question that I hope we continue to ask and get better at asking as our technologies get slipperier and easier at hiding, how they're working and what's kind of the extent of their systems.